are some cases that the law buries on purpose, not because the evidence was thin, not because the witnesses disappeared, but because what the investigators found was the kind of thing that changes a person, quietly, permanently. And the men and women who looked too long into it never quite came back the same. This is one of those cases. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. Have you ever had a neighbor, a tradesman, a regular visitor, someone who came around often enough that they became part of the ordinary texture of your life? And something about them just felt wrong? Not dangerous, necessarily. Not alarming enough to name. Just a wrongness, a small, persistent discomfort that you couldn't justify, and so you set it aside. Because what else do you do with a feeling you can't explain? Tell me in the comments. Because after what I'm about to tell you, I think you'll understand that feeling a great deal differently than you did before. What happened in the mountains of Virginia in 1878 was, on its surface, a financial dispute. Two brothers, a debt collection route that wound through some of the most isolated communities in the Blue Ridge Range. A system of ledgers, contracts, and handshakes that had kept several small mountain towns running on credit for nearly 2 decades. And then, one autumn, a county assessor named Aldous Greer arrived at a farmstead at the end of Cold Ridge Glen Road, a road that most people in the county had never heard of and fewer had ever traveled, and found something that made him ride through the night without stopping, without eating, without speaking to a single soul, and without ever returning to that part of the mountains again. What he found was not just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of something that had been happening slowly, deliberately, for a very long time, behind the most ordinary face imaginable. Let me take you there. The Blue Ridge Mountains in the 1870s were not the kind of place where news traveled fast. The region was, by any measure, one of the most isolated in the eastern United States at the time. A landscape of ridges and hollows and valleys that folded into each other in ways that could confuse even experienced travelers, where communities a mere 20 miles apart might as well have existed in different worlds, and where a man could live and die in the same hollow without anyone 2 counties over ever knowing his name. The Civil War had passed through and left its particular damage, not just in lives and farms, but in the administrative and social fabric that had already been thin. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Population records were incomplete. People moved, disappeared, re-emerged, or simply vanished into the landscape. And in the absence of any reliable mechanism for tracking ordinary human movement, there was no reliable mechanism for noticing when people were gone. This was not an accident of history. The Harwick brothers understood it completely. Communities in this era, particularly in isolated mountain regions, were deeply suspicious of outsiders, but equally and profoundly dependent on the few trusted figures who moved between them, the circuit preachers who carried news and spiritual authority, the mail riders who connected families across impossible distances, and perhaps most critically, the credit men. Before banks extended their operations into rural Virginia, a process that would not be meaningfully complete until well into the 20th century, the entire economic life of these mountain communities ran on credit. Farmers borrowed against the next harvest. Households kept running tabs at general stores that might not be settled for months. And the men who extended and tracked that credit who maintained the ledgers that were, in practical terms, the financial backbone of entire communities, were trusted with a degree of intimacy and authority that is difficult to fully appreciate from a modern perspective. These men were not banks. They were more than banks. They were the system itself. And into that system, in approximately 1859, the Harwick brothers inserted themselves with what would prove to be extraordinary patience and foresight. Cornelius Harwick was the elder by 6 years, and by every account he was the architect. In 1878, the year that the investigation began, he was 51 years old, and he looked it in the way that certain men look their age, not from deterioration, but from a kind of crystallization, as though time had simply finished carving him and stopped. He was lean, standing perhaps 5 feet and 10 inches in his boots, with a long, narrow jaw and deep-set gray eyes that rarely blinked at the rate that eyes normally blink. His complexion was very pale, with the particular pallor of someone who had spent years outdoors without ever quite seeming to be touched by the sun. His hair had gone entirely white before he was 40, and he wore it combed flat against his skull with a precision that matched everything else about him. His hands were the detail most witnesses commented on. Strangely smooth for a man who spent so much time riding and working, as though the normal roughening effect of physical labor had simply declined to attach itself to him. He had a habit, noted by nearly everyone who spent any time conducting transactions with him, of tilting his head slightly to the left when he was performing calculations, which was almost constantly. He spoke in complete sentences. He never interrupted. He never raised his voice. He was the kind of man who made you feel in his presence that every word was being carefully weighed before it left his mouth, and that anything insufficiently precise would simply be discarded before it arrived. He was, by every surviving account, deeply uncomfortable to be alone with. But almost no one was alone with him for long, because there was Fletch. Fletcher Harwick was 6 years younger than his brother, which put him at 45 in 1878, and he was, in nearly every measurable way, Cornelius's opposite. Broad across the shoulders and solid in the chest, with reddish-brown hair gone mostly silver at the temples, and a wide, expressive face that seemed constitutionally incapable of hostility. Fletcher Harwick was the kind of man who made you feel within 5 minutes of meeting him that he had always been glad you existed. He laughed easily and often. He remembered names with extraordinary fidelity, not just the names of the people he dealt with directly, but the names of their siblings, their late parents, the names of the dogs and horses that had been mentioned in passing during transactions years ago. He knew who had fought in the war and where. He knew who had lost siblings to fever and who had survived a barn fire and who had been quietly estranged from a cousin for 15 years over a property dispute that everyone had agreed not to mention. He carried this knowledge not as information, but as genuine warmth, or at least as something indistinguishable from it. People who encountered the brothers together on their circuit described a dynamic that is, in retrospect, almost textbook in its precision. Fletch arrived first, emotionally. He set the temperature of every encounter. By the time Cornelius opened his ledger, the people across the table already felt comfortable, already felt seen, already felt that they were among men who understood them and wished them well. Cornelius's coldness in this context was reframed automatically as simple professionalism, the necessary counterweight to his brother's warmth. You didn't distrust Cornelius because Fletch was right there, and Fletch was impossible to distrust. Together, they were a perfectly constructed instrument, and what that instrument was constructed for, what it had always been constructed for, would not become clear for nearly 2 decades. Their circuit covered roughly 400 square miles of mountain terrain, beginning and ending at their home base in the small settlement of Van Thorpe, Virginia, and winding through a dozen distinct communities over the course of 14 days. They made the circuit twice a month in the warmer seasons and once a month when winter made the mountain roads difficult. They logged every transaction in matching leather-bound ledgers that Cornelius maintained with the devotional consistency of a man who believed that imprecision was a moral failing. Every debt extended, every payment received, every interest calculation, every penalty assessed for a missed installment or a partial payment, and the penalties were real, though Fletch delivered them so gently that most debtors remembered the conversation as an act of compassion rather than a financial consequence. The communities on their route had grown to depend on them with the quiet totality of dependency that develops so gradually that it stops being visible. Multiple generations of the same families appear in the Harwick ledgers, grandmothers' debts on the same page as their adult daughters, farm obligations that pass between husbands and wives and surviving siblings with a continuity that made the brothers' records the most complete accounting of certain families' financial lives anywhere in existence. People planned their harvests around the brothers' schedule. They set aside payment weeks in advance. The Harwick brothers' arrival, twice a month, was a fixed point in the rhythm of life in those communities, the way the seasons were a fixed point, expected, normalized, entirely woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. And that normalization, that deep, unquestioned weaving in, was, investigators would eventually conclude, the entire foundation of what the brothers had built, not the ledgers, not the credit system, the normalization. No one is entirely certain when the first disappearance occurred. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of this case. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect, when you sit with it long enough. Because by the time anyone began asking questions, by the time the absence of certain names began to register as strange, rather than simply as the ordinary mobility of mountain life, the record had already been carefully and consistently managed for what investigators eventually estimated was between 10 and 15 years. The earliest losses, the first households that had entered into what the brothers called settlement arrangements and whose members had not been seen since, were essentially invisible in the historical record. The trail did not begin to become visible until well into the late 1860s, and even then, only to someone who was specifically looking for it, which, for a very long time, no one was. What investigators established through months of painstaking cross-referencing of the Harwick ledgers against county tax records, church birth and death registries, and the accounts of longtime residents, was that at some point during the war years, approximately between 1862 and 1866, the brothers had introduced a second parallel system into their operation, not a financial fraud in the conventional sense, though certain elements of financial manipulation were present. Something that used the structure of their lending business, the way a trap uses the shape of a familiar trail, something that would have been invisible unless you were already suspicious, and that offered no reason for suspicion. It centered on what the brothers recorded as irrecoverable debt. These were households that had borrowed heavily during the multiple converging catastrophes of the war era: the disruption of markets, the absence of male labor, the livestock epidemic that swept through the northern ridge communities in 1868, the drought of 1865 that destroyed harvests across a wide swath of the mountain region. Families who had extended their credit beyond what any realistic assessment of their future earning capacity could service. Under a conventional arrangement, this would have led to negotiated forgiveness, debt restructuring, or, in the hardest cases, property forfeiture. These were understood outcomes. People knew what they meant. What the Harwick brothers offered instead, quietly, privately, in conversations that were never recorded in the main ledgers, was something different. A settlement arrangement, a way to discharge the entire debt, all of it, immediately, without losing the farm or the house or the livestock, without any public record of default, without any of the social shame that accompanied failure on a debt in a small mountain community, where everyone knew everyone and memory was long. The terms were not written down in any document available to the ordinary oversight that governed their business. The details existed only in a separate, smaller ledger, what investigators came to call the secondary notebook, that was not discovered until late in the search, and whose language was so deliberately oblique that it took months of consultation with legal scholars and, eventually, medical professionals to fully parse what was being described. The core of it, stripped of its careful vagueness, was this: a debtor household could discharge their entire financial obligation to the Harwick brothers in exchange for providing what the notebook recorded, consistently across dozens of entries spanning more than a decade, as a permanent contribution to the brothers' private collection. The nature of that collection was not described anywhere in the document, not once, not in any entry, not in any notation or marginal comment. The silence around it was absolute. And that silence, the investigator who eventually cracked the notation system said, was not an omission. It was a decision. Pause with me here for a moment, because I want to make sure the full weight of what I'm describing is landing. This was not a crime of passion. It was not an act of desperation or sudden violence. What the Harwick brothers had constructed over nearly 2 decades was an architecture, a slow, patient, interlocking system in which the trust they had spent years building became the mechanism by which they could ask for the unthinkable and receive it. Because the families who entered these arrangements did so in the belief that they had no other reasonable choice. The brothers had positioned themselves so completely as the financial nervous system of their communities that refusing them carried consequences that extended far beyond a simple business dispute. A bad word from the Harwicks meant no credit, and no credit in those mountains in that era meant a very particular kind of slow ruin. They had constructed walls around their victims over 20 years, with warmth, with patience, with the kind of careful attentiveness that people confuse almost universally with care. And now, before we go any further into what Aldous Greer actually found at the end of Coldridge Glen Road, I want to ask you to do something for us. If you're listening to this on Behind Dark Tales and you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. We tell the cases that history tried to quietly close the file on, the ones that got sealed and archived and left to sit in county cabinets until someone who was looking for something else stumbled across them. Real stories, real people, real atmosphere. We don't rush them and we don't sensationalize them. We tell them the way they deserve to be told. Subscribe. It means everything to us. And if you're hearing this on any other channel, please know that our content is being used without our permission. Report it for us and then come find us directly. Now, let's go back to the mountains. The first thread that would eventually unravel the whole thing was pulled not by any official investigator, not by any sheriff or assessor or court officer, but by a 38-year-old widow farmer named Mirabelle Austin, who lived on a modest property near the northeastern edge of the Brothers Circuit in a place called Sullen Fork. Named, her neighbors said, for the way the creek there ran brown and slow and reluctant even in the height of summer, as though the water itself had reasons to be unhappy. Mirabelle had come to the Harwick Ledger through her late husband's estate. He had died of fever in the winter of 1875, leaving her with a farm she understood and a debt she had not entirely known about. And she had spent the 2.5 years since paying it down with the same methodical consistency she applied to everything. She was not, by temperament, a suspicious person. She was precise. There is a distinction. Suspicious people look for problems. Precise people notice when the numbers don't match, and then they follow the discrepancy until it resolves, or until it becomes clear that it won't. In the late summer of 1878, Mirabelle noticed a discrepancy. 2 families on the road below hers, the Emery household, a husband and wife who had farmed the same patch of southern-facing slope for more than 30 years, and the Dalt household, a man named Corvin Dalt, who had operated a small cooperative and whose barrels had been a familiar sight throughout the valley, had, within the space of 3 months, ceased to appear, not moved. The word her neighbors used when she asked was always gone, as though the act of departure had somehow been completed without anyone witnessing it. The properties sat unattended. The Emery animals had been absorbed into a neighboring farm with a quiet efficiency that suggested a transaction of some kind, though no sale had been recorded at the county office. The cooperative stood open and empty, the tools still on their hooks, a half-finished barrel still on the stand, the shavings still on the floor. When Mirabelle asked about them, she got answers that were consistent in a way that began to bother her precisely because of their consistency. Everyone said the same thing in almost the same words. They had settled their accounts with the Harwicks and moved on. Where? She asked. And this is where the consistency broke, slightly but consistently, in the same place. Nobody knew. Nobody thought it was their business to know. Nobody, she noticed, seemed to think there was anything worth examining in the fact that 2 families she had known her entire adult life had dissolved from their properties without a word, without a forwarding address, without a single piece of correspondence to anyone in the community they had lived in for decades. Mirabelle thought about this for 6 weeks. She kept her own records of what she observed during those 6 weeks. The state of the Emery property, the state of the cooperative who came and went on her road, what was said and not said when she raised the subject. She wrote everything down in the same ruled notebook she used for her farm accounts, in the same small, even hand she used for everything. She was not building a case. She was doing what she always did, writing down what was true so she could look at it clearly. And when she looked at it clearly, she wrote a letter to the county assessor's office in Warrenview. She was careful. She was not making an accusation, she wrote. She was noting an irregularity. 2 households removed from their properties without recorded sale or formal departure, connected by a common explanation that she could not verify, involving men whose business practices she had no specific reason to distrust. She was simply noting it, in case someone with more authority thought it worth a look. The letter sat in a pile at the county office for 6 weeks. Then, on a Thursday morning in late October of 1878, a man named Aldous Greer rode out to Sullen Fork to hear what Mirabelle Austin had to say. He was 44 years old, compact and methodical, with a brown beard trimmed close and wire spectacles that he was in the habit of losing in his breast pocket and finding again at intervals throughout the day. He had been a county assessor for 11 years, and in 11 years he had seen the full range of what rural county work produces: property disputes and fraudulent surveys and tax evasion and the occasional embezzlement, the ordinary human catalog of mistakes and dishonesty and desperation that runs through any community that exists long enough. He was not easily surprised. He was not easily moved. He was the kind of man whose primary virtue was thoroughness, and who understood that thoroughness, in his line of work, was worth considerably more than intuition. He spent 3 hours with Mirabelle Austin. She showed him her records. She walked him through her observations. She described the families. She described the consistency of the explanation she'd been given. She said, clearly and without any attempt to dramatize it, that she did not know what had happened to those families, but that something about the pattern of their disappearance did not match any pattern of ordinary departure she had ever observed. Greer rode out to the Emery property before the light failed. He stood in the yard for a long time. He walked through the empty house, which still held the particular dense quiet of a space recently abandoned. Not the thin quiet of a long empty building, but something heavier. He found the kitchen in a state that he described in his subsequent report as inconsistent with planned departure, food stores still in the larder, clothing still on hooks, a pair of good work boots sitting just inside the door as though their owner expected to return. He rode back to Mirabelle Austin's farm that evening. He stayed the night in her barn. She offered the spare room, but he declined, a detail she noted in her own records, along with the observation that he seemed like a man who needed to think without walls close around him. In the morning, he rode for Coldridge Glen Road. The Harwick homestead was a substantial property by the standards of the region. A main house, a barn, and 2 outbuildings, set in a clearing, at the end of a road that became progressively less maintained the further you followed it from the main valley track. The red oak forest pressed close on all sides. Even in late October, with the leaves mostly down and the light coming clear through the stripped branches, there was a quality to that clearing that Greer struggled to articulate in his subsequent report. He eventually settled on the word deliberate, as though the placement of the buildings, the positioning of the trees, the layout of the whole property had been arranged to produce a specific effect on someone arriving there, an effect of enclosure, of being far from anything that could hear you. The brothers were not present, both horses were gone. The fire in the main hearth had been banked recently, but was burning low, in the way a fire burns when it hasn't been tended for a day or more. The kitchen table held the remains of a meal, 2 plates, scraped but not washed, a half loaf of bread beginning to harden at the cut end. One of Cornelius's coats was still on its peg beside the door. Either he had left in a hurry, or he had not expected to be away long. Greer did something that was, technically, outside his authority as a county assessor. He searched the house. What he found in the main rooms was unremarkable on the surface. The quarters of 2 men who had spent their lives in a particular practical routine with little evidence of aesthetic interest or personal indulgence. Functional furniture, adequate but not comfortable beds, a collection of books in Cornelius's back room that struck Greer as unusual given what surrounded them, the expected volumes of accounts and ledgers and commercial law, but also a considerable number of texts on natural philosophy, anatomy, and chemistry, the kind of reading, Greer noted, that you might expect from a trained medical man, though neither brother had any medical credential anyone could find. The main ledger collection was present and intact, stacked with military precision in a locked wooden cabinet, whose key Greer found in Cornelius's desk drawer. He spent an hour with the ledgers. He found them extraordinarily well maintained. 20 years of transactions organized with a clarity that most professional accountants would have envied. He also found, on a close reading of the most recent volumes, the oblique notations that referred to certain accounts as settled by private arrangement, with a reference code that pointed to a secondary document he could not locate in that room. He went looking. The barn was ordinary in every respect. He went through it carefully and found nothing that concerned him. Then he went to the second outbuilding. It sat back from the others, half hidden by a stand of old red oak, whose roots had grown close enough to press against the stone foundation, and it was secured with a padlock that Greer later described as more substantial than any padlock he had ever seen on an agricultural outbuilding. The hardware was serious. It was the hardware of a man protecting something he valued very much. He broke the lock with a hammer from the barn. The door opened inward, and Aldous Greer stepped inside. What happened in the following minutes is described in the official investigation records in a language that is clinical to the point of deliberate opacity. The report does not use words like horror. It does not use words like revulsion. It uses words like anomalous and extensive and systematically organized. This was, legal historians who have subsequently reviewed the case have concluded, a calculated choice, an attempt by the officials who compiled the record to describe what was found in language that could technically communicate the facts without fully conveying their nature, as though the facts, stated plainly, were simply too heavy for ordinary language to carry without breaking. Let me try to convey what was there as clearly as I can, while staying within the bounds of what this story requires. The Harwick brothers had a collection. It had been assembled over a period of what investigators estimated at between 12 and 17 years. It occupied the entirety of a building that had been purpose-built for it. Shelving constructed along all 4 walls from floor to ceiling, additional freestanding cases in the center of the room, a workbench along the back wall with tools and materials organized in the same meticulous order that characterized everything in the brothers' operation. The light inside was controlled, small shuttered windows positioned to minimize direct sunlight, which investigators understood immediately was deliberate preservation practice. The collection was not primarily composed of objects in the conventional sense of that word. What the brothers had been accumulating over more than a decade of settlement arrangements with families in desperate debt were not possessions. They were not furniture or tools or valuables. They were something that required the preservation techniques that the chemistry texts in Cornelius's study described in detail. Formaldehyde compounds, beeswax preparations, treatments that the medical consultants brought in later in the investigation recognized as sophisticated for the era, far beyond anything a layperson would have developed without dedicated study and practice. Each item in the collection was tagged. Small paper labels in Cornelius's unmistakable handwriting, a name, a date, a brief notation that the investigators spent weeks learning to decode, and which, once decoded, indicated the source household with a precision that matched almost exactly the secondary notebook's settlement records. The bodies of the missing persons were not found in their entirety. I want to say that sentence again, because it deserves to be understood fully. The bodies of the missing persons were not found in their entirety. What was in that building were the portions the brothers had chosen to keep, preserved, labeled, arranged with a care that spoke unmistakably of something beyond mere hoarding or concealment. I won't catalog what specifically was preserved and how. The sealed records go further than anything I'm going to describe here, and the testimony of the men who were present that day, what survives of it, in private letters and an unpublished memoir, suggests that full disclosure of the room's specific contents is not something most people who read it came back from unchanged. What I will tell you is this: the collection was organized by a logic that was internally consistent. The items were treated with care. They were, by every indication, deeply and genuinely important to at least one of the brothers, and somewhere in the room, behind a partition wall that had been added at some point and plastered and painted to blend with the original structure so precisely that the sheriff's deputy who found it nearly walked past it twice. They found Cornelius's private notebook, not the secondary ledger with the settlement records, not the financial accounts. The private notebook, small, dark leather, with a brass clasp that had been recently polished. It contained 32 pages of entries in Cornelius's hand. The 4 men who read it that first day, Greer, the county sheriff, a deputy named Harlan Creed, and a second deputy whose name does not appear in any subsequent record, were not prepared for what they encountered there. It was not a confession. It was not a justification. It was not the account of a man describing crimes, or a man wrestling with conscience, or a man explaining himself to any imagined future reader. It was a journal of aesthetic appreciation. Cornelius Harwick had written across 32 pages, with evident care and what appeared to be genuine intellectual engagement, about the qualities of his collection. Not with the language of violence, not with the language of power or domination or cruelty, with something that was, in its construction, almost indistinguishable from the language of a naturalist or a serious collector of fine objects, the kind of careful, considered prose that a man of genuine learning applies to a subject he has studied deeply and loves well. He used words like remarkable and harmonious and of particular integrity. He had opinions about which acquisitions represented the finest examples within their category, and why. He noted the evolution of his preservation techniques over the years, early efforts he considered crude compared to later work, specific procedural improvements he had made after careful experimentation, materials he had discovered that produced superior results to those he had previously used. He described the aesthetic principles that governed his selection process, the qualities that elevated one specimen above another in his estimation, the relationship between what he chose to keep and what he chose, as he put it, to return to the earth. There was not a single word in all 32 pages that acknowledged that the things he was describing had once been living human beings. Not one word, not a hesitation, not a deflection, not an avoidance. Simply no acknowledgment whatsoever, as though the category of human being did not apply to anything in his collection, as though it had simply never occurred to him that it should. This, and I think it's worth pausing to sit here with this for a moment before we continue, is the detail that the people who read that notebook found most difficult to carry afterward. Not the collection itself, though that was terrible enough. The notebook. Because a collection can be explained, however inadequately, by the frameworks we have for human darkness, desperation, pathology, the fracture points in a person created by some specific damage. We have language for that. We have structures for understanding it, even if the understanding doesn't make it better. But a man who writes about what he has done with the sustained pleasure of a scholar discussing his life's work, without a single word that suggests he has ever inhabited the same moral universe as the people around him, that is something that requires a different kind of reckoning. And Aldous Greer, who spent more time with that notebook than anyone else in the first days of the investigation, wrote about it years later in a private letter to his younger brother as the thing he carried out of those mountains that he was never fully able to set down. Not the building, he wrote, the notebook. Because the building told me what they had done. The notebook told me who Cornelius Harwick had always been. And that distinction, he wrote, was the one that followed him into the rest of his life. I want to stop here and ask you something, because this is something the case made me think about in a way I still haven't entirely resolved. We have a comfortable framework, most of us, for violence born from desperation or rage. It is terrible, but it is, in some minimal sense, comprehensible. There was something, it broke. This happened. We understand the shape of that story even when we hate every word of it. What we don't have a framework for, what disturbs us at a level that goes below conscious thought, is the wrong that coexists peacefully with ordinary life. That sits across the table from you and asks after your family. That remembers which of your horses you favor and whether the harvest was good this year. That does what it does, and then closes the door and writes about it quietly by lamplight in a careful, private hand. Have you ever sat across from someone and felt, not fear exactly, but a quiet wrongness? Something you couldn't justify, and so you didn't, and then later you wondered? Tell me in the comments, because I think more people have had that experience than ever talk about it, and I think this case is one of the reasons it stays with us. The Harwick brothers were never captured. I want to be precise about this because the record is sometimes misrepresented. The manhunt was real. It was not half-hearted, and it was not abandoned quickly. The Virginia County Sheriff coordinated with adjacent counties almost immediately, and within 2 weeks of the discovery at Coldridge Glen Road, descriptions of both brothers had been circulated to law enforcement contacts across a region stretching from southern Maryland to northern Tennessee. Fletch's distinctive silver-reddish hair and easy sociability made him, in theory, the more recognizable of the two. Cornelius's physical distinctives, the pallor, the tilted head, the smooth hands, were documented carefully. Wanted notices were printed. Circuit riders were asked to watch for them. The administrative machinery that existed for such purposes was deployed as fully as it could be. There were sightings. A man matching Fletcher's description was reported at a boarding house in Kingsport, Tennessee, approximately 3 weeks after the discovery. He had been, the proprietor said, unreservedly pleasant, friendly and talkative at meals, generous with his payment, the kind of guest who makes a household feel warmer for his presence. He had paid for a week in advance and departed one morning without taking everything. A single traveling bag, left neatly under the bed, which the proprietor found when she went to prepare the room. She described its contents as ordinary: a change of clothing, a shaving kit, a small leather notebook with a brass clasp that she opened to the first page, and then, she said, immediately closed and locked in her own cabinet without reading further. She turned the notebook over to a Tennessee deputy 3 months later. The deputy filed it with a notation indicating it might be connected to the Virginia inquiry. It disappeared from the deputy's office sometime before the follow-up correspondence arrived from Virginia. No one was ever able to determine what happened to it. The proprietor, when interviewed a second time, was asked to describe what she had seen on the first page. She said it appeared to be the beginning of a list, names, each followed by a date and a notation she could not clearly remember, and that her reason for closing the book immediately was not that she had understood what she was seeing, but that something about the way the names were written had made her feel that she was reading something she should not be reading. She struggled, she said, to explain what she meant by that. It was, she eventually said, the same feeling she got when she found a private letter that had been opened and left out, as though the contents were not for her, as though they were very specifically not for her. Of Cornelius, there was less and less certain. A farmer in western North Carolina, near the Tennessee border, reported a lean, pale man matching his description who had passed through the area on foot, asking detailed questions about available land on remote ridge properties. The farmer had spoken with him for perhaps 20 minutes on the road. He said the man had been quiet, precise, and thorough in his questions, not rude, not alarming in any specific way, but possessed of a quality the farmer found difficult to name. When asked to describe it, he said, he asked the kind of questions that made you feel like he already knew the answers and was checking to see if you did too. He had noticed the slight leftward tilt of the head. He had thought nothing of it at the time. When he later saw the description in a circular and understood who he might have been speaking with, he said he went back over those 20 minutes many times, looking for the thing he should have caught. He never found it. That, he said, was what stayed with him. He had stood right next to it on a road in broad daylight, and it had been perfectly ordinary, the final documented sighting, and it is included in the official case file as unverified. Flagged as a point of interest rather than confirmed evidence, was filed in 1880 by a mail rider named Sethwick Prowse, who traveled the southernmost section of what had been the Harwich Circuit and who claimed to have encountered both brothers together on foot, moving through a narrow mountain pass in the early morning of a day in late November. He said the weather was cold and clear. He said Fletch had looked up when he heard the horse and had waved, a friendly, ordinary wave, the kind you give a neighbor on a road you both travel regularly, relaxed and unhurried. He said Cornelius had not waved. He had simply raised his eyes to the rider and held them there, with that slight, familiar tilt. And then the pass had curved, and Prowse had come around the bend, and there was nothing behind him when he looked back. Just the road and the trees and the cold light coming low through the stripped branches. He said he had ridden on for a mile before he fully absorbed what he had seen. He filed the written account because, he said, he thought someone ought to know. The investigation formally closed in 1883, with no arrests made, both brothers listed as fugitives at large, and a final case tally that investigators acknowledged in their internal communications almost certainly undercounted the actual number of victims. The sealed records were transferred to the county archive in Warrenview, where they remained locked in a cabinet for decades. A historian who accessed them partially in the 1940s declined to publish his findings. His notes, discovered in the 1980s, became the primary modern source for the case's reconstruction. The community at Sullen Fork and the broader territory of the Harwich Circuit spent years afterward in a particular kind of collective processing that had no name and no formal support. Families who had bought goods from the brothers, paid debts to the brothers, invited the brothers to their tables, suddenly found themselves in the position of having to reckon with what that intimacy meant now. Some of them discovered, through the investigation, that neighbors they had known for years had entered settlement arrangements and were among the missing. The social fabric that had made the brothers' operation possible, the deep, normalized trust, became the source of a community-wide grief that had no clean edges and no obvious resolution. People stopped keeping credit accounts entirely in some hollows for several years, not because credit was dangerous, but because the ledger had become something else. Mirabelle Austin remained at Sullen Fork for the rest of her life. She did not seek attention for her role in beginning the investigation. She did not give interviews or make public statements. She continued to farm, continued to correspond quietly with county officials about the status of the inquiry for several years, and continued, her neighbors noted with a mix of affection and slight exasperation, to keep extremely detailed records of everyone who came and went on her road. She died in 1911 at the age of 71, with her mind intact and her notebooks full. Her private papers were found in a tin box under a floorboard when the farmhouse was renovated in the 1950s. Among them, farm accounts, correspondence with relatives, a partial journal spanning several decades, and near the back of the tin, folded and refolded until the creases had gone nearly transparent, a single sheet of paper in her handwriting dated several months after the discovery at Coldridge Glen Road. It was a list, names, dates, locations, families she had identified through her own independent research, through careful and persistent conversations with people across the valley over months and years. who she believed had entered settlement arrangements with the brothers and whose members had not been accounted for in the official investigation. There were 19 names on her list. The official investigation had documented evidence connected to 11. Her list was nearly twice as long. At the bottom of the page, she had written 2 lines. The first, "I do not know what became of them." The second, "But someone should." She had underlined the word someone once, firmly, not in agitation, in the manner of a woman who was simply noting one more time what was true. We don't know, even now, how many people the Harwick brothers' operation ultimately consumed. We don't know where they went, or whether the thing they had built in those Virginia mountains was the only version of it they ever constructed, or whether they built again somewhere else under other names with the same long patience and the same careful warmth. We don't know what happened to Cornelius's private notebook after it left the Coleridge Glen Road building, or whether the notebook the Tennessee proprietor found was a continuation of it. We don't know whether Fletcher's ease with people was a performance he maintained consciously in service of his brother's purposes, or whether some genuine part of it was real. And when you sit with those 2 possibilities, you find that you cannot entirely decide which one is worse. We don't know, and that not knowing, the kind that doesn't close with time, that doesn't thin out or become easier to carry, is perhaps the most honest conclusion available to a case like this. Because the truth is that the Harwick brothers operated almost entirely in the gap between what people saw and what was actually present. They lived in the space that trust creates, and that space, the space between the face a person shows and what lies behind it, is not a gap that closes when a case does. It is not sealed by an investigation or resolved by an arrest. It simply exists, as it has always existed in every community and every relationship and every ordinary transaction between people who cannot see inside each other. Aldous Greer lived to the age of 77. He retired from county work in 1885 and spent the rest of his years in a house in a town called Pemberton, well away from the mountain country. His correspondence with his brother suggests he found ways over time to live with what he had seen, that he was for the most part a functional and even contented man in his later years, with a family and habits and the ordinary consolations of a life well built. But his brother noted, in a letter written in 1902, a detail that I find I cannot stop thinking about. He wrote that Aldous had, in the years since the investigation, developed a strong and consistent aversion to ledger books. Not a dramatic aversion, not a thing he spoke about. Simply, when a ledger appeared in his presence, any ledger, the most ordinary accounting book, he became quiet in a particular way and found, usually within a few minutes, a reason to leave the room. That was all. Just ledger books. The Blue Ridge Mountains of southwestern Virginia are different now than they were in 1878. The roads are paved. The communities are connected. The isolation that allowed the Harwicks to construct their operation across 20 years without serious question has been replaced by the ordinary dense connectivity of modern life. There are no more credit men on mountain circuits. There are no more settlement arrangements written in private notebooks with brass clasps. The specific conditions that made the Harwick system possible are gone. But the pass where Sethwick Prowse saw them walking north is still there. The red oaks are still dense on either side. And if you stand in that pass in the early morning, in the particular cold quiet of a November Blue Ridge dawn, with the sound of wind working through the old trees and the light coming gray and level over the ridge, you can understand maybe just slightly how something can walk right past you, wave with a familiar hand, and be gone before you think to look behind you. That's the Harwick case. A cold file, a sealed record, a tin box under a floorboard with a list that was always too long. And somewhere at the center of it, if you follow the thread the way Mirabel Austin followed it, the outline of something that was never truly about money, never truly about debt. It was about patience. It was about understanding how much people are willing not to see when they have been given sufficient reason to trust, and about knowing with calm and absolute certainty exactly how long you can sustain that trust before anyone starts to look. You made it to the end with us, and I'm genuinely grateful for that. These cases don't get lighter with retelling, but they deserve to be told with the full weight of what they are. And that's what we try to do here every time. If something in this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the Mirabel Austins in your own life, the people who notice what everyone else decides not to, who write things down and follow the discrepancy, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment. Tell me what struck you. Tell me if you've known someone like that. Tell me if you've been someone like that. And if you have a case, a local story, a family account, something that got sealed in a county cabinet or buried in an estate archive or passed down in private correspondence that no one else has ever read, bring it to us. The best stories we've ever told came from someone who reached out and said, I think this one deserves to be heard. You're listening to Behind Dark Tales. We'll be here for the next one.